Hi, this is Dr. Mike Chupp, your host for the weekly podcast of the Christian Medical and Dental Associations, which we call CMDA Matters. Dr. Jeff Barrows and I recently had a conversation with a most respected and influential leader in the arena of free speech, as well as constitutional law, as it impacts our students and our graduates in healthcare. My guest this week is Professor Robbie George from Princeton University. You know, 2021 has been a year in which several of our CMDA undergrad and grad chapters in various states have faced attacks as well as intimidation from LGBTQ groups just because they choose to identify with CMDA and with our clearly articulated positions on marriage and sexuality. At the conclusion of this Prof. George interview, I will be introducing a new bonus segment with some incredibly helpful encouragement in our first ever CMDA Matters More Today. I welcome you to listen in to words of encouragement from a surprising source, actually an Ivy League law professor. Well, I'm delighted today on CMDA Matters to have with us Professor Robbie George, who's the McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence and Director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University. He's served as chairman of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom and on the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, as well as the President's Council on Bioethics. Many different honors, medals, distinctions that Professor George has had in his life. He's been a judicial fellow at the Supreme Court of the United States, where he received the Justice Tom C. Clark Award. He attended Swarthmore College, I hope I pronounced that correctly, Prof. George, and holds degrees of Doctor of Jurisprudence and a Master of Theological Studies from Harvard, and several degrees from Oxford University, some of which, Prof. George, I had to look up online to see what the various initials meant. They're not in medicine. And 22 honorary doctorates, recipient of U.S. Presidential Citizens Medal, many other distinguishing awards, and then many, many books. Making Men Moral, Civil Liberties and Public Morality, and In Defense of Natural Law, as well as The Clash of Orthodoxies, Conscience and Its Enemies, and then one that's near and dear to my co-host today, Dr. Jeff Barrows, Embryo, A Defense of Human Life. Welcome to the program, Prof. George.
It's a pleasure to be on with you. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Well, I have become familiar with you over the years and reading different things that you've written, especially for First Things, as well as Public Discourse. And it seems like the frequency of those articles in the last year or so have increased, that at least that have come to my attention. But more recently, an interview that you did with a good friend of yours, I believe he's at Harvard, Professor Cornel West, at the Museum of the Bible, right after the election, which was an urgent appeal to Americans on honesty and courage during a time of polarization. And I was just really moved by that interview. Thank you for doing that with Cornel West.
Well, thank you. Cornel is my dear brother. He and I are at different places on the political spectrum. I'm a traditional conservative. He is honorary chairman of Democratic Socialists of America. So we have a lot to talk about. We have a lot to debate and discuss. But we also agree on some very fundamental things. We believe in free speech. We believe in the importance of being open to a range of viewpoints, not to embrace moral relativism, neither of us do that, but to recognize our own fallibility and the need to learn from each other. And you're not going to learn from people unless your mind is at least sufficiently open to entertain counterarguments and challenges. Cornel, over the years, has taught with me. We've taught together seminars here at Princeton. We've lectured around the country together. We've written together, including for major national publications. We've done some singing together. We both love to sing, especially old hymns. And of course, we pray together. Cornel is a Christian. I am too. We have that in common. And he's a very, very dear friend, as I say, a brother to me. And despite our political differences, I just love him.
Well, your James Madison program has had an impact on a lot of really influential people, I think, over the years, including one of our past guests, Dr. Carl Truman from Grove City College.
Oh, yes.
And his book that he wrote during that fellowship, our listeners, I got a lot of positive feedback. And he's going to come to our national convention, Prof. George, next spring to speak to us on the whole issue of Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self.
I am so happy to hear that. It is a fabulous book. He is a top-notch intellectual. The Christian community would do very, very well to acquaint itself with his scholarship. He's got a lot to say about how we got into the condition that we're in this culture, and he's got some ideas pointing the way forward, how we can truly be salt and light and how we can make things better. I was delighted to have him as a fellow of the James Madison program here at Princeton, and I look forward to having him back again someday. We'd very much like to have him back.
Well, let's jump right into some questions specifically about free speech on college and university campuses. And so for our listeners who may not be as familiar with constitutional law, that's probably a lot of them, what is the current understanding of constitutionally protected speech, First Amendment right for speech, especially in the academic environment?
Well, the first thing that we have to understand is that constitutional protections for speech and religion and other civil liberties are protections that run against governments, state and federal, and municipal, of course, local governments. These are not protections that run against private individuals or private institutions, against religious organizations such as churches, against private universities, at least insofar as they're truly private and not being funded by the government. A lot of money, even at private universities now, is federal money, is government money. But the first thing to understand is that your First Amendment rights don't run against your neighbor or your church or your private school. They run against the government, but they are powerful protections. So, for example, the right to free speech immunizes you from any action by government to punish you for your speech or impede your speech, to try to prevent you from advocating a certain point of view, so long as your speech doesn't fall into one of the so-called unprotected categories. And those unprotected categories are a very narrow, a small class of categories of speech. There is no such thing as a category of unprotected speech called hate speech. I have to correct my students on this when they enter my classroom in my courses in constitutional interpretation and civil liberties, because they somehow have gotten it into their heads before studying any constitutional law that hate speech is not protected by the First Amendment. But the truth is that there is no category of unprotected speech corresponding to the idea of hate speech. There just isn't. So a lot of what people condemn today as hate speech is fully protected under the First Amendment. The categories of unprotected speech, it's a very small group, are things like slander and libel, defamation, intimidation and threats, obscenity. Now, that's something that people sometimes forget about. They think that obscenity is protected, but it's not protected. That is unprotected speech. Now, there's an interesting question, of course, that the court has struggled with, Supreme Court has struggled with over the years about what constitutes obscenity, what the definition of obscenity is. But obscenity itself is not protected speech. False advertising is not protected speech. Conspiracy to commit a crime is not protected speech. But advocacy, whether it's religious advocacy, political advocacy, advocacy of any and every type, is protected. And that means the government cannot punish you, discipline you, subject you to civic disabilities based on your stating your point of view. Now, having said all that, and additionally now I'll note that the very core of the First Amendment is political speech. The thing that is most strongly protected is political speech. Let me add that there are protections of a different nature that can and do run against many private institutions, where those private institutions, such as universities, give you an example, Princeton University, where I teach, have contractually bound themselves with, for example, their students or their faculty or their staff to respect freedom of speech as part of academic freedom. So although I'm not protected in my speech rights by the First Amendment against Princeton University because it's a private university, I am protected every bit as fully as I would be if Princeton were a public university and the government was involved. I am protected by contractual obligations that Princeton University has assumed by representing to the public, including to its employees, including to its students, that it is an institution that honors freedom of speech, desires open dialogue, wants people to feel free to speak their minds. And this is true of most, at least most secular universities. And they are bound under law just as stringently as if it applied to the government. They are bound under law to respect those contractual obligations to honor freedom of speech. Now, we at Princeton have the most robust possible free speech protections because we have adopted by faculty vote and incorporated into our university rules what are called the University of Chicago principles, a set of principles first set forth by a committee at the University of Chicago, and that university, of course, was the first to adopt them. We were the second. They are very strong free speech protections, as strong as you can get. And they've now been adopted, I believe, by 70 or 80 other colleges and universities. I'd like to see yet more adopt those free speech principles. And that's because you can't really do serious intellectual inquiry if people are not allowed to probe and prod and question and challenge and unsettle each other and discombobulate each other and have a real dialogue. It really takes that kind of openness to pursue the truth. And I'll just conclude with this point, that we respect freedom of speech, especially on college and university campuses, not because there is no truth and therefore people should be able to say whatever they want, but rather because we acknowledge that there is a truth, and it's very important that we find the truth, and we can only find the truth if we're allowed to poke and prod and push and challenge and debate and have a robust discussion.
Well, Professor George, with that in mind, how would you characterize the current state of free speech on college campuses, especially in terms of student understanding? And you've already alluded to this as well, the distinction between private and public universities in terms of free speech on campus.
The situation right now is not good. And a great deal of the problem is rooted in misunderstanding. Many colleges and universities themselves, their administrations, don't understand their contractual, or in the case of public universities, constitutional obligations to recognize and honor free speech. Many students don't have the slightest idea of the scope of free speech rights on their campuses. Many students are censoring themselves, not speaking their own minds, in part because they fear peer pressure, peer disapprobation, but in part because they believe they might be crossing a line, that their speech is not protected, when in fact it is. I'll tell you a phenomenon that I see at universities around the country now, and it's really terrible. Students and faculty members will say something that defies the established dogmas on the campus, usually secular, progressive, woke dogmas on the campus. They'll say something you're not supposed to say, according to those dogmas. Well, then a mob will form. It might be on social media. It might be in person. A mob will form demanding that the university administration take some disciplinary action against this faculty member or this student who has said something that you're allegedly not allowed to say. Very often, the victim of those mobs, feeling extremely vulnerable, feeling abandoned because very few people have the courage to come to the defense of a person to protect his free speech rights, very often that person will almost instinctively apologize for what he said, even though he has no obligation to apologize, even though he shouldn't apologize, even though he hasn't said anything wrong. but he will apologize because he himself doesn't understand that he is protected by the university's free speech principles, either the contractual principles in the case of a private university or contractual and constitutional principles in the case of a public university. People give up their own rights. I often tell my students in my civil liberties course, the best thing we can all do to protect our basic rights is to exercise them. Mm-hmm. But very often people won't do that. And many times they won't because they're just ignorant of the rights that they have, or the scope of the rights, or the applicability of those rights. So if you deny or defy some campus dogma, for example, if you state the truth that human beings cannot change sexes, if you state that truth and you come under attack for it, and somebody demands that your university's administration punish you or discipline you, suspend you for doing it, my goodness, don't cave in, don't yield, don't allow yourself to be intimidated and bullied. Don't apologize. You have nothing to apologize for. All you did was tell the truth. At least you spoke your mind. You said what you believed to be true. In that case, it happens also to be true, but you spoke what you believed to be true. You have a right to do that. You have a right, certainly at a state university under the Constitution, and at most private universities, you have the right to do that as well under their contractual obligations to respect freedom of speech. So stand up for your rights. Let me say something to everybody else, even if you're not the victim. Stand with the victim. It's a scandal that people, and I want to say this especially to Christians, it's a scandal for us to sit by and say nothing when somebody's rights are being violated. Whether we agree with what they said or disagree with what they said. It may be a person who's attacking some belief that we have, or maybe even our own Christian faith. We still have an obligation to honor and protect and stand up for that person's free speech rights. We'd want people to do that for us, wouldn't we? What's the golden rule? Jesus teaches us, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you.
Absolutely.
And when a person is wrongly under attack, is under attack for exercising his basic rights, and those rights are in jeopardy, we should be in the forefront of speaking out in defense of that person. Don't abandon him. Don't allow him to just be devoured by the mob. Stand up and offer some support. Have a little courage.
Well, you have some interesting relationships. I've heard in an interview with you or read in print that you have the ability, and you talk about it frequently, to sit down with people at the table, including other faculty at Princeton or in the Ivy League that you really disagree with vehemently, like a Peter Singer, and have the ability to have a civil and respectful discourse. So a friend of mine who shared that video with you and Cornell at the Museum of the Bible was like, I want to hear from Prof. George about how can we sit down with people that we disagree and respectfully talk about issues and still somehow remain, maybe not friends, but in a reasonable relationship with one another. So important right now in medicine, especially on that issue you brought up about not believing that a biological male can become a female somehow. That's ubiquitous out there right now in the public square for medicine.
Most people don't know this. Abraham Lincoln, the great foe of slavery, the man who gave us the Emancipation Proclamation, the man who saved the Union fighting the Civil War, who put into place the conditions that made it possible, despite his assassination, for slavery to be formally abolished and finally abolished by the 13th Amendment. Abraham Lincoln's lifelong best friend was a man named Joshua Speed, who was a supporter of slavery. Lincoln detested slavery. He loathed it. He said, if anything is wrong, slavery must be wrong. And yet, he could have not only a friendly conversation or an acquaintanceship, but an actual deep friendship with someone who fundamentally disagreed with him. Now, if Lincoln can do that, I can do that, and you can do that, and everybody out there can do that. Let's remember, first and foremost, no matter how much we disagree with a person, no matter how horrific we think that person's views are. I think Peter Singer's views on things like infanticide are pretty horrific.
Yes.
But Peter's a friend of mine. We have conversations. We disagree, but we have conversations. The first thing I have to recognize about Peter Singer or anybody else is there's a precious human being made in the very image and likeness of God. All right, now there's something to begin with. Mm-hmm. There's something to begin with. Now, I don't want his view to prevail. I'd like to talk him out of his view.
Amen.
Right? I want to have this conversation, but I don't want him to be destroyed. I don't want him to be punished. I want him to have the right to free speech, actually. I have protected, I have stood up for, I published an article in the Philadelphia Inquirer defending his free speech rights when they were under attack by people I agree with on the substantive merits of the case. These were disabled people who came to Princeton, in some cases chained themselves in their wheelchairs to the gates of the university, demanding that Professor Singer be fired, that his tenure be revoked, because they disagree with his views, as I do, on things like infanticide or the status of severely cognitively disabled people who he, wrongly in my view, believes are not actually persons. They're human beings, he thinks, but not persons. Well, despite my agreeing on the substance with the disabled protesters, and not with Professor Singer, certainly, I argued against the protesters and argued that it would be unjust, an offense, for Princeton to fire Peter Singer for honestly expressing views that he happens to hold, even though I think they're dreadfully wrong. Now, as you can imagine, I got some pushback from that from my own friends, including my friends in the Christian community, who really think that somebody who holds Peter Singer's views really should be fired by a university like Princeton. But I don't agree. Something Professor Singer and I agree about, by the way, is the importance of truth-seeking. He and I are on the same page. He's not a moral relativist. He's not one of these guys who says there is no truth. He knows there's a truth. He thinks he's got it. I think he doesn't. I think the opposite of what he says about infanticide and some of these other issues is true. But he believes that there's a truth. He believes it's important to get the truth. And he believes in freedom of speech. He would have defended my rights had I been the guy under attack, even though he thinks my sanctity of life ethic and my Christian beliefs are fundamentally wrong. And so he was one of the lead signatories to the statement that Cornel West and I put out in 2017, which was then signed by about 5,000 other people, called Truth-Seeking, Democracy, and Freedom of Thought and Expression. And I invite your listeners to look that up online, do a search. Again, Truth-Seeking, Democracy, and Freedom of Thought and Expression, written by Cornel West and myself, Peter Singer, one of the lead signatories, making the case that the project of truth-seeking, which should be acknowledged whether you're a Christian or not, the project of truth-seeking and the project of Republican democracy, a regime like ours here in the United States, self-government, require a robust protection of freedom of speech. And not just a robust protection, they require that people exercise their rights to freedom of speech in order for us pushing each other, probing each other, unsettling each other to get nearer to the truth and to actually operate for the common good in our public deliberations together as citizens of a Republican democracy. Singer agrees with that every bit as much as I do.
Wow, powerful. So powerful. Thank you, Professor Robbie George, for joining us today on CMDA Matters. And we believe it matters more today as we encourage Christians who are going through their training. You know, medicine has this apprenticeship, and you're so influenced by those a year or two ahead of you on the path, and they're influenced by those ahead of them. And it is kicking against the goads, as Jesus said to Saul on the road to Damascus. It's not common for us in medicine to kick against the goads. And so you give me hope, absolutely, as a professor at Princeton, in a place of great influence. We will pray for you, Professor Robbie George.
Thank you.
And listeners, I want to encourage you to pray for Professor George and his influence, as well as Christopher Tollefson and Farr Curlin and others within our profession who have a great deal of influence. Thank you, and I hope that we will get to cross paths and maybe even get to convince you to come and speak sometime at our national convention for CMDA.
I would love to do that. I'd love to meet more of your members. And thank you very much for conversing with me today. It's really a pleasure to be on the podcast.
Well, I hope that this encouragement from Prof. George is a breath of invigorating fresh air. And there's more available. The rest of this interview can be found in our new add-on podcast that we're calling CMDA Matters More Today. This segment should now be available as the next podcast on our CMDA Go app or your favorite podcast platform, as well as on our CMDA website. In that More Today segment, Prof. George will tell us how campus leaders and student groups, as well as those of you in healthcare practice, especially those who are employed by healthcare systems, you may be facing antagonism and hostility from secular woke dogmas. He is crystal clear that we must be strong and courageous and not apologize for what we believe, standing on biblical truth. You know, understandably, many Americans are concerned about the rising threats to their religious freedom. They feel the culture changing all around them, and we fear that our beliefs will soon be marginalized as a form of bigotry. Others, young Christians in particular, are tired of the culture wars, and they wonder whether courtroom battles are truly worth it, or even in line with the teachings of Jesus. In the book Free to Believe, Luke Goodrich, who's with Beckett Law and has helped us at CMDA, offers a reasoned, balanced, gospel-centered approach to religious freedom. He applies biblical understanding to a number of the most hot-button cultural issues of our day. He also offers practical steps that Christians can take to respond to religious freedom conflicts in an informed, responsible, and graceful way. And on top of all that, Luke just wrote to me yesterday and passed the incredible news that a district court in Texas had issued what we've been waiting for since the days of David Stevens in 2016, a permanent injunction against the transgender mandate. We praise God for this incredible result. Well, these perils and the antagonism faced by the West, as well as the church, are really unprecedented. Threats to religious liberty, redefinitions of marriage and family, and attacks on the dignity of human life. How should we as Christians respond to this multifaceted challenge? Addressing each dimension of this challenge, Dr. Albert Mohler Jr.'s book, The Gathering Storm, provides answers and equips us as Christians both to give an answer for the hope that is within us and to contend for the faith that was once and for all delivered to the saints. You can pick up your copy of Luke Goodrich's or Al Mohler's book today at cmda.org/store or by calling 888-230-2637 today. Well, in case you haven't heard, on Saturday morning, August 21st, CMDA is hosting a webinar that we're calling A Loading Dose of Faith Prescriptions. Well, today I've got Dr. Bill Griffin. Around here we call him Dr. Griff, who's the Director of Faith Prescriptions, here to tell us more. So Griff, welcome. This webinar seems like a great opportunity to introduce our members to the new Faith Prescriptions series.
Mike, I could not agree more. This webinar on Saturday, August 21st will be a tremendous event for our CMDA family to hear from two colleagues regarding spiritual interventions with our patients. First, Dr. Farr Curlin, a hospice and palliative medicine physician at Duke University, will speak on the case for practicing medicine Christianly, along with Dr. Kathy Scarborough, a family medicine physician and residency instructor in Gadsden, Alabama, who will speak on sharing the good news. Their talks will be followed by a Q&A session, a great opportunity for docs to drill down into each topic. I'll be hosting this event, just trying to stay out of their way, as our viewers are equipped to meet the spiritual needs of their patients.
Griff, I think this is going to be a perfect introduction to this new Faith Prescriptions series. What is the schedule regarding the videos that you've been working on for such a long time?
Well, we're planning on a total of 25 videos at this point, and the first 10 are currently available on CMDA's Online Learning Center. These videos will be led by 20 different doctors from across the country, addressing a wide range of topics, taking a spiritual history, praying with patients, keeping it natural, addiction treatment, caring for refugees and immigrants, and many others. At this webinar, I'll be releasing the titles of the first 10 currently available and also the titles of the next 15 episodes to come.
I bet many listening right now want to register. How can they do that?
Well, this is easy. Registration, which is free to members, happens at CMDA's website, cmda.org/events. Just scroll down a bit till you see a loading dose of faith prescriptions, and you're there.
Thanks, Griff. I really look forward to joining you and Farr and Kathy on August 21st, along with many of our colleagues, our members and volunteers.
Great.
I want to ask you listening, are you struggling to help patients achieve their health goals? To help colleagues out of burnout? To care for your own well-being and stop trying to fix others? Beginning on October 12th through November 16th from 3 to 5 p.m. Eastern Time, and that'll just be one afternoon a week, a 6-week intensive training that we call the 501 Foundations in Christian Coaching, and that will take place via Zoom online. I truly hope you'll take advantage of this wonderful opportunity to learn and to grow in foundational knowledge and your coaching skills. You just go to cmda.org/events for more information. We've also made it easy for you to get your hands on a copy of Dr. Fuz Rana's book, Humans 2.0. You can just click on our Book of the Month link in the show notes or go to cmda.org/Book of the Month, one word, and make your donation of any amount today to CMDA, and we will ship a copy to your door. After you attend our webinar with Dallas Theological Seminary this weekend, I have no doubt that you will want to hear more from Dr. Rana yourself. So if you've been considering supporting CMDA, August is a great time to do so, and we'll send you Dr. Rana's book. I really want to encourage you, if you're a woman in healthcare, to consider the Women Physicians and Dentists in Christ in-person conference for 2021. There's still time for you to make arrangements to attend September 30th through October 3rd in Grand Rapids, Michigan. You can not only qualify to get 16 hours of live CME credit, but also there are enduring CE credits that will be available in our Learning Center. For more on this or just to register, you can go to cmda.org/events or click the link in our show notes today. Well, as I bring us to a close in this program today, we know that protecting First Amendment rights for healthcare professionals like you, as well as grad students in healthcare, matters big time to our members here at CMDA. Because being salt and light in this present cultural moment matters to our Lord and great physician, Jesus Christ. Making sure that you, our listeners, understand your legal rights and constitutional protections so you can exercise them matters to CMDA, and CMDA Matters. Thanks for listening today. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to like and subscribe so we can be reaching more healthcare professionals. By the way, I want to give a shout out to 2 people who've worked so hard for the last 18 plus months to make CMDA Matters a reality every week of the year. Our assistant producer, Brianna Snyder, and our sound engineer, Rusty Sluter, who faithfully work hard to bring you content that educates, encourages, and equips you that you might glorify God as a follower of Christ in healthcare. Don't forget the CMDA Matters More Today segment that we just released with more insight from Professor Robbie George of Princeton University. Next week, I'll have a very important conversation along with Jeff Barrows with Dr. David Prentice about the development of a so-called death culture in the United States and what we can do as Christians in healthcare to stop it. Don't miss it. Until then, may the Lord bless you and keep you, make His face to shine upon you, and give you peace.
This podcast has been a production of the Christian Medical and Dental Associations. The opinions expressed by guests on this podcast are not necessarily endorsed by the Christian Medical and Dental Associations. CMDA is a nonpartisan organization that does not endorse political parties or candidates for public office. The views expressed on this podcast reflect judgments regarding principles and values held by CMDA and its members and are not intended to imply endorsement of any political party or candidate.